The doors of St. Edmund's Chapel were open, and the light that fell through them was the pale, honeyed light of late May, the kind that makes stone look warm and forgiveness look easy. Coralie Drummond stood at the threshold in a gown the colour of a midnight sea, her red curls pinned loosely at her nape, and she did not tremble. She did not smooth her skirts. She did not look down. Beside her, close enough that his sleeve nearly touched hers, stood Theron Blackwell, the Grand Duke of Ashenmere, 6 feet and 2 inches of him, dressed in deep crimson wool with gold buttons that caught the chapel light like small, deliberate fires. He did not offer his arm. He simply stood where he stood, which was next to her, which was enough. Inside, 200 guests had turned in their pews. The organ had not stopped playing, but the organist's fingers had faltered for half a beat, which was the musical equivalent of a gasp. The bride's mother had dropped her hymnal. 3 women in the second row had begun whispering at once, producing a sound like wind through dry grass. And at the altar, standing in a bottle-green coat with a cream rose pinned to his lapel, Roderick Swann, who had sent the invitation, who had wanted her to see what she had lost, looked at the woman he had discarded and the man she had arrived with, and his face did something complicated. But that was the end of it, or nearly the end. The beginning was 6 weeks earlier, in a gallery that smelled of linseed oil and dust, and it started not with a chapel, but with a canvas. She arrived at Hartfield on a Tuesday in April, when the wisteria along the south wall was just beginning to open, each bud a tight fist of purple that would, within the week, unfurl into something extravagant. Coralie noticed the wisteria before she noticed the house, which said something about her, and she was aware of what it said. She was a painter. She noticed colour before architecture, and she did not apologise for it. The house itself was enormous. Not the ornamental enormity of new money, all columns and porticos added for show, but the settled, confident mass of a building that had been standing for 3 centuries and intended to stand for 3 more. Honey-coloured ashlar, mullioned windows, a gravel drive that curved through an avenue of chestnuts whose canopies were thick with new leaf. Hartfield was the kind of house that did not need to announce itself, and so it did not. Garrett Poole, the Duke's steward, met her at the servants' entrance with a handshake that was firm and businesslike, and a manner that suggested he had been told to expect her and had prepared accordingly. "Miss Drummond, the gallery is on the 2nd floor, east wing. I've had the windows uncovered and the dustcloths removed. There are 14 portraits requiring assessment, and per your aunt's letter, you'll determine which need restoration and which need only cleaning." 14, Coralie said, because it was more than she had been told. The Duke's mother was a collector. Poole said, in a tone that implied the Duke's mother had been a collector, the way a river is a collector of everything in its path. "Some date to the 16th century, some are merely old. The distinction, I'm told, is your expertise." Coralie followed him through the servants' corridor, up a back staircase with worn treads and iron banisters, and into a long gallery that stopped her in her tracks. The light was extraordinary. It came through 7 tall windows on the east wall, each one throwing a column of pale gold across a parquet floor that had been polished to the colour of dark honey. The portraits hung on the opposite wall, 14 of them, spaced at even intervals, their frames gilded and their surfaces dimmed by decades of candle soot and kitchen smoke that had drifted up from the floors below. Some were darkened to near illegibility. Others merely needed attention. One, a full-length portrait of a woman in a white gown near the far end, had a crack running through the varnish like a dried riverbed. Coralie set down her leather satchel, the one her aunt had given her when she finished her apprenticeship, the one with the brass clasp that no longer closed properly and the interior stained with every pigment she had ever mixed. She opened it and laid out her tools on the marble-topped table beneath the nearest window. Soft cloths, solvents in small glass bottles, fine brushes, the kind that cost more than most people's shoes, a magnifying lens with a bone handle. She had not seen the Duke. She had not expected to. Men who owned houses like this did not meet portrait restorers at the door. They were informed by men like Poole that the work had begun, and they nodded, and they went on with whatever it was that Grand Dukes did with their mornings. So, when a voice behind her said, "The woman in white is my grandmother," Coralie did not flinch, but she did turn, and the man standing in the gallery doorway was not what she had expected either. Theron Blackwell was younger than she had imagined. 32, perhaps 33, with chestnut hair swept back from a broad forehead and hazel eyes that were watching her with a quality of attention she recognized because she possessed it herself. It was the way a person looks when they are genuinely seeing, not performing interest, but actually cataloguing, actually curious. He wore a steel blue wool coat, well cut, but not ostentatious, and his boots were clean, but not new. He stood the way men stand when they are comfortable in a room that belongs to them, which is to say, he stood without apology, but also without performance. "Your Grace," Coralie said, because the greeting was required, and then because she could not help herself. "The crack in the varnish runs through her left hand. It will need stabilizing before I can clean the surface." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the architecture of a smile, the way a building's lines suggest a doorway before you see the door. "Most people comment on her face first," he said. "Her face is intact," Coralie said. "Her hand is not." He looked at her for a moment longer than was socially comfortable, and then he nodded once and left the gallery. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and the silence that followed was the productive kind, the kind that meant she could work. The first week passed in the particular rhythm of restoration. Coralie arrived at the gallery each morning at 7, before the house stirred, and laid out her materials in the order she had been taught, which was the order her Aunt Helena had always used, which was the order that made sense if you understood that patience was not a virtue in this work, but a technique. She began with the simplest cases. A hunting scene from the 1780s that needed only a gentle cleaning to reveal a landscape of startling green beneath the soot. A pair of companion portraits, husband and wife, whose frames were more damaged than their surfaces. She worked steadily, methodically, and she kept notes in a leather-bound journal that she tucked into her satchel at the end of each day. The Duke did not reappear for 3 days. When he did, it was on a Friday afternoon, and he came with tea, not carried by a servant, carried by himself on a tray that he set down on the marble table with the careful precision of a man who did not often carry trays and was determined not to spill anything. "Poole tells me you've been working since dawn," he said. 7 o'clock, Coralie said, because she was precise about these things. Dawn was at 5:30. "And you did not want the extra 90 minutes? "I wanted breakfast more." He looked at the tray, which held 2 cups, as if he had anticipated this exact exchange and had prepared for it. They drank tea standing in the gallery, surrounded by the faces of his ancestors, and he asked her questions about the restoration process that were neither patronizing nor performative. He wanted to know how she determined the original palette beneath the discoloration, how she chose her solvents, how she knew when to stop. These were the questions of a man who was interested not in flattering her, but in understanding what she did. Coralie found herself answering at length, and then catching herself, and then continuing anyway, because he was still listening. "My aunt would say I talk too much about varnish," she said, after a particularly detailed explanation of the difference between natural resin and synthetic coatings. "Your aunt," he said. "Helena Drummond. You know her." She painted the portrait of my mother that hangs in the morning room. 20 years ago, when I was 12. She told me to sit still, and I did not, and she painted me out of the background and replaced me with a spaniel." Coralie laughed. It was sudden and unplanned, and she covered her mouth with the back of her hand, which left a faint smudge of linseed oil on her chin. "That sounds exactly like her," she said. Theron looked at the smudge on her chin and did not mention it. He finished his tea, set the cup on the tray, and said, "You have something on your face, Miss Drummond. I assume it is occupational." Then he left, and Coralie wiped her chin and went back to work, and the gallery felt slightly different than it had before, in a way she chose not to examine. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday, carried by a boy from the village post office, who handed it to Poole, who brought it to the gallery, where Coralie was halfway through cleaning a portrait of a man in a powdered wig whose expression suggested he had eaten something that disagreed with him. The envelope was cream-coloured, thick, sealed with wax the colour of old gold. She recognised the hand before she opened it. Roderick's handwriting had always been ornate. The loops and flourishes of a man who believed penmanship was a form of self-presentation. She had once found it charming. She did not find it charming now. Miss Coralie Drummond is cordially invited to attend the marriage of Mr. Roderick Swann to Miss Annabel Hartley Cross at St. Edmund's Chapel, Briar Hollow, on the 27th of May at 11 o'clock in the morning. Below the printed text in his own hand, he had added a line. "I do hope you'll come. It would mean a great deal." Coralie read it twice. The first time, she felt the old thing, the thing she had spent 2 years training herself not to feel, which was the lurch of the ground beneath her feet, the sensation of standing on what you thought was solid floor and discovering it was ice. The second time, she felt something else, something cooler and clearer, something that had edges. He had not invited her because it would mean a great deal. He had invited her because he wanted her to see. He wanted her to stand in the back of a chapel in whatever dress she could afford and watch him marry a woman whose father owned 3 mills and a shipping concern, and he wanted her to feel the distance between his life and hers, which was the distance he had chosen, which was the distance he had told her was necessary when he had broken their engagement 18 months ago. "I cannot build a future on talent alone, Coralie. You must understand that. A man in my position needs more than affection." She remembered the sentence exactly because it was the kind of sentence that etches itself into bone. He had not said he did not love her. He had said that love was insufficient. He had said it in the sitting room of her aunt's cottage while Helena was in the garden, and he had said it without raising his voice, without visible cruelty, which made it worse because it meant he had rehearsed it, which meant he had decided before he walked through the door. Coralie set the invitation on the marble table beside her solvents. She looked at it for a long moment, at the gold wax seal and the careful handwriting and the cream paper that was probably chosen by Miss Annabel Hartley Cross, who would have opinions about stationery because women with money always had opinions about stationery. Then she went back to the powdered wig portrait and cleaned its surface with steady hands. She did not cry. She did not need to. The hurt was old now, and she had done the work of carrying it, and it was lighter than it used to be. But the invitation sat there on the table for the rest of the afternoon, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of a draught from a window, a constant small disturbance at the edge of your attention. Theron found the invitation 3 days later, not by snooping, by reflex. He had come to the gallery to tell her that Poole had arranged for additional candles in the East Wing corridor, and to ask if she needed anything from the village, and the cream envelope was sitting on the table where she had left it, its flap open, its gold seal cracked, and his eye caught the names before he could look away. He said nothing about it, not that morning, and not the next. But Coralie noticed that his visits to the gallery, which had been occurring every 2 or 3 days, began occurring daily. He would come with tea or with a question about one of the portraits, or once with a book of Dutch still life paintings that he had found in the library and thought she might find useful. "The composition in the third plate," he said, handing her the volume. "The way the light falls on the pewter. I thought of the Reynolds you're working on." "You're comparing a Dutch master to a Reynolds," Coralie said. "Most art historians would have opinions. I am not an art historian. I am a man who noticed a similarity and thought you would tell me whether I was wrong." "You're not wrong," she said. "The light source is the same. Reynolds borrowed from Vermeer more than he admitted." On another afternoon, she was working on the companion portraits, the husband and wife from the 1750s, whose frames had suffered more than their surfaces, and Theron appeared with not tea, but a question. "The woman in the blue sash," he said, standing before the wife's portrait with his hands behind his back. "She looks amused, not happy, not serene. Amused, as though she knows something the painter didn't." Coralie stepped back from her work and looked at the portrait from where he was standing. He was right. Seen from a distance at the angle where a visitor to the gallery would naturally stand, the woman's expression resolved into something knowing, a suppressed smile, a private thought captured in oil. "The painter was probably her husband," Coralie said, "or someone he hired. Either way, she's sitting for a portrait that will hang in his house, wearing his colours, posed the way he wanted, but her face is her own. She kept that." Theron looked at the portrait for a long moment. "You admire her?" "I admire anyone who keeps something for themselves when the rest has been arranged by someone else." He turned to her then, and the quality of his attention shifted, became something more direct, and Coralie felt it land on her the way gallery light lands on a painting when the curtain is drawn back. Suddenly and completely. "Yes," he said. "So do I." They walked the gallery together that evening, which was not something she had planned, but which happened because he had asked her to explain the chronology of the collection, and explaining required moving from portrait to portrait, and moving from portrait to portrait meant walking side by side through the long room while the sunset poured through the west, facing windows on the opposite wall, which it had never done before because she had always left before sunset. She told him about brushwork and dating techniques, and the way a painter's confidence shows in the angle of the strokes, and he listened the way he always listened, which was with his whole body, leaning slightly forward, his eyes tracking her hands when she gestured at details. She showed him where the 16th century portraitist had been uncertain, painting the rough twice, the ghost of the first attempt visible beneath the second, and where the 18th century painter had been bold, applying the highlight to the subject's eye in a single loaded stroke that had dried three-dimensional, a tiny ridge of white paint that you could feel with your fingertip if you dared. "You don't dare," Theron said. "I don't dare," she confirmed. "That paint has been dry for 240 years. Touching it would be a violation. But you want to." She looked at the portrait, at the tiny ridge of white paint that had captured light for nearly 2.5 centuries, and she felt the painter's confidence across the distance of all those years, a single gesture preserved in material. "Every time I see it," she said. "Every single time." He sat on the window seat and watched her work, which he had begun doing with a regularity that she ought to have found intrusive, but did not. He was a good watcher, quiet, still. He did not fill silence with talk the way most people did, and when he did speak, it was because he had something to say, rather than because the silence had become uncomfortable. It was during one of these sessions, on an afternoon when the wisteria outside the gallery windows had reached its full extravagance, the entire south wall draped in cascading purple like something from a painting that would be accused of exaggeration, that he asked her about Roderick. He did not ask directly. He said, "The invitation on the table. You haven't responded." "No," Coralie said, not looking up from her work. "Will you go?" "I haven't decided." A pause, the sound of her brush against canvas, which was the sound of horsehair on linen, which was barely a sound at all. "What would going accomplish?" he asked. "Nothing productive." "And what would not going accomplish?" Coralie set down her brush. She looked at him, at this man who sat in window seats and brought her tea and asked questions about light in paintings, and she weighed whether to tell him the truth. "If I don't go," she said, "he'll believe I stayed away because I couldn't bear it. He'll believe I'm still hurt. He'll tell his new wife, probably on their wedding night, that his former fiancée was too heartbroken to attend, and he'll say it with something that looks like sympathy, but is actually satisfaction." "And if you go?" "If I go, I stand in the back of a chapel in a work dress, and he gets the satisfaction of seeing what I've become, which is a woman who cleans other people's paintings for a living. Both options are his. Both serve him." Theron was quiet for a long time. The wisteria moved outside the window, heavy with its own weight, and the light in the gallery shifted from gold to amber as a cloud passed and then cleared. "There is a third option," he said. "Which is?" "You go, but you don't go alone." Coralie looked at him. His face was composed, his voice was even, and his hazel eyes were steady in a way that told her he had been thinking about this for longer than the duration of this conversation. "Your Grace," she said, "I am a portrait restorer working in your gallery. If I arrive at a village wedding on the arm of a Grand Duke, every person in that chapel will assume either that I am your mistress or that I have lost my mind." "They will assume," he said, "that you are my guest, which you will be." "Why would you do that?" He stood up from the window seat. He was very tall, and when he stood, the gallery seemed to rearrange itself around him, the way a room does when the largest thing in it moves. "Because a man who sends an invitation designed to wound does not deserve to have it work," he said. And then, more quietly, almost as an afterthought, "and because I would like to." He left the gallery before she could respond. She refused for 4 days, not with dramatic declarations or tearful explanations, but with the simple mechanics of avoidance. She arrived at the gallery earlier, before he came with tea. She left later, after the house had settled into its evening quiet. She kept her head down and her brushes moving and her conversation when Poole or the maid spoke to her, friendly but brief. On the second day of avoidance, Poole appeared in the gallery with a crate of fresh candles and a manner that suggested he had something to say but was too professional to say it without preamble. He replaced the candles in the wall sconces one by one, working his way down the room with methodical patience, and then he said, without looking at her, "His Grace has taken his tea in the library this morning, and yesterday morning. He does not normally take tea in the library." "The library is a fine room for tea," Coralie said, not looking up from her canvas. "It is a terrible room for tea. The north windows make it cold in the morning, and the chairs are designed for reading, not sitting. He takes his tea in the library because the library is not the gallery, and he believes you do not wish to see him." Coralie set down her brush. "Mr. Poole." "I am simply reporting the household schedule, Miss Drummond. The domestic arrangements are my responsibility, and I take them seriously." He straightened the last candle and picked up the empty crate and regarded her with the calm, unreadable expression of a man who had been managing a Grand Duke's household for 15 years and had learned that the most effective form of interference was the kind that could be denied. "He carries his own trays," Poole added from the doorway. "He has never done that for anyone else. I thought you should know." Then he left, and the gallery was quiet again, and Coralie stood in front of the companion portraits, with her brush in her hand, and thought about a man drinking cold tea in a cold library because he believed she wanted distance, and whether the distance was what she actually wanted, or whether it was simply what she was accustomed to. It was Helena who ended the avoidance, though Helena was 60 miles away in her cottage near Bath, and she ended it by letter. "My dearest girl," Helena wrote, in handwriting that was the opposite of Roderick's, blunt and practical with ink splotches where she had paused to think. "I received my own invitation from the Swan boy. I assume you received yours. I also assume you are currently standing in a very beautiful gallery belonging to a very eligible duke, pretending that you do not know why he offered to escort you to this wedding. You are a gifted painter, Coralie, but you are not gifted at pretending. Your face has always told the truth 3 seconds before your mouth caught up. Go to the wedding. Wear something that is not covered in turpentine. And for the love of God, let someone be kind to you. You have spent 2 years proving you don't need anyone. You have proven it. Now stop. Your thoroughly exhausted aunt, Helena." Coralie read the letter in her room at the village inn where she was staying, a small room with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked Mrs. Cope's herb garden, and she folded it and pressed it flat and placed it inside her satchel next to the wedding invitation. The next morning, she arrived at the gallery at her usual time and found Theron already there, standing before the portrait of his grandmother in the white gown. The crack in the varnish had been repaired. The surface had been cleaned. The woman's left hand, which had been nearly invisible beneath decades of damage, was now visible, and she was holding a small blue flower that Coralie had uncovered petal by petal over the course of 3 days. "Forget-me-not," Coralie said, because she could see he was looking at it. "Your grandmother was holding a forget-me-not. It was there the whole time under the damage." He did not turn around. He stood with his hands behind his back, looking at his grandmother's hand and the flower it held, and Coralie watched the line of his shoulders and the way the morning light caught the chestnut of his hair, and she made a decision. "I'll go," she said. "To the wedding, if the offer still stands." He turned then, and his expression was careful, composed, but not entirely controlled, and what escaped the control was something warm and unguarded that lasted for perhaps 2 seconds before he gathered it back. "It stands," he said. "I don't have anything to wear." "That," he said, "is a problem with solutions." The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Cope, the innkeeper, a woman of 60 with silver hair and the practical authority of someone who had been running a business since before Coralie was born, appeared in Coralie's room the following evening carrying a garment bag of oiled cloth. "I heard," she said, because in a village the size of Briar Hollow, everyone heard everything, and the fact that the Duke's portrait restorer would be attending the Swan wedding on the arm of the Duke himself had travelled through the village like fire through dry timber. She unzipped the garment bag, and inside was a gown. It was sapphire, not pale blue, not sky blue, not any of the tentative, apologetic blues that women were told to wear when they wanted to seem modest. This was the blue of deep water at noon. The fabric was silk, heavy and lustrous, with a neckline that was square and clean and a waist that was defined without being cinched. It was the kind of gown that did not ask permission. It walked into a room, and the room adjusted. "It was my daughter's," Mrs. Cope said. "She wore it to a ball in London 12 years ago and left it here when she moved to Edinburgh. It's been hanging in the wardrobe ever since, waiting for someone the right shape and the right amount of angry." Coralie looked at the gown and then at Mrs. Cope, and then at the gown again. "I'm not angry," she said. "No," Mrs. Cope agreed. "You're something better than angry. You're ready. Put it on." It fit. Not perfectly, because perfect fit requires a tailor in 3 weeks and Coralie had 4 days, but it fit the way good silk fits a body that is neither too careful nor too careless, which is to say, it fit well enough that the imperfections disappeared when she stood up straight, and Coralie always stood up straight. Mrs. Cope looked at her in the gown and nodded once, which was, from Mrs. Cope, the equivalent of a standing ovation. "You'll need shoes," she said, "and your hair pinned properly, and that paint stain on your left thumb will need to go." "The paint stain doesn't go," Coralie said. "It's cadmium yellow. It's permanent." Mrs. Cope looked at the yellow stain on her thumb, visible against the sapphire silk like a small badge, and something in her expression softened. "Then let it stay," she said. The last days before the wedding passed in a way that was both too fast and too slow. Coralie finished the gallery work, all 14 portraits assessed, 7 cleaned, 3 restored, 4 identified as needing specialist treatment that was beyond her scope. She wrote her final report in her journal, detailing each canvas, its condition, her interventions, and her recommendations, and she left the journal on Theron's desk with a note that said only, "Completed. Invoice to follow." But there was one canvas she had not included in the report, a small panel, no larger than a folio page, that she had been working on in the evenings in her room at the inn. She had started it the night of their first tea in the gallery and had added to it each night since, working from memory because she was good at memory and because the subject was not the kind of thing she could paint in his presence. It was his hands, not a portrait of his face, not a full figure study, but a study of his hands as they had looked holding the teacup that first afternoon, the right hand curved around the porcelain, the left resting on his knee, fingers long and blunt-tipped and still. She had painted them in the warm light of the gallery, and the painting was small and precise, and it was the truest thing she had made in 2 years. She did not intend to show it to him. She painted it because painting was how she understood things, and she was trying to understand what was happening to her, which was that she was beginning to trust a man who was kind, without requiring anything in return, and that trust felt dangerous, because the last time she had trusted, it had cost her everything she thought she knew about her own judgment. The morning of the wedding, she stood in front of the small mirror in Mrs. Cope's inn and looked at herself, red hair pinned in loose curls at her nape, 2 tendrils free at her temples, because Helena had always said that perfectly pinned hair was the refuge of women who were afraid of being seen. Blue eyes, clear and steady. The sapphire gown, which in the morning light looked less like a dress and more like a declaration. Her aunt's cameo brooch pinned at her collar, the one Helena had given her the day she completed her first professional commission. The small oval face in profile that Helena said was their great-grandmother, but might have been anyone. The paint stain on her left thumb, cadmium yellow, permanent. She did not look like a woman who had been jilted. She did not look like a woman who was making a point. She looked like a woman who was going to a wedding, which is what she was doing, and the fact that the wedding was designed to humiliate her was, this morning, a fact that had lost its teeth. A knock at the door. Mrs. Cope's voice. "The Duke's carriage is here, dear." The carriage was not ostentatious. Black lacquer, well maintained, drawn by a pair of matched bays whose coats shone like polished wood. Theron was standing beside it, and when he saw her come through the inn door, he went still in the particular way that men go still when something interrupts the sentence they were constructing in their head. He was wearing the crimson coat, deep, rich crimson, the colour of good wine or old roses with gold buttons and a collar that stood just high enough to frame his jaw, cream waistcoat beneath, dark trousers, polished boots. His hair was combed but not tamed, and the morning light caught it and turned the chestnut to something warmer, something that made Coralie think of autumn even though it was the last week of May. "Miss Drummond," he said, and then he stopped. "Your Grace," she said, and then she waited, because she was curious about what would come next. What came next was very simple. He looked at her, not at the gown, not at the pinned hair, not at the brooch, but at her face, at her eyes, at whatever it was behind her eyes that he had been learning to read over 6 weeks of tea and gallery light and conversations about varnish. "You look," he said, and paused and reconsidered, and then said, "Ready." It was not a compliment about her appearance. It was an observation about her state. And it was exactly right. "I am," she said. He offered his hand to help her into the carriage. His grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a second longer, and she was aware of every one of those seconds, and she suspected he was too. St. Edmund's Chapel was 1.5 miles from the village, set on a hill above the river where the beeches grew thick and the light filtered through new leaves in shades of green that Coralie would have needed 4 pigments to mix. The lane leading to the chapel was lined with carriages, modest carriages mostly, the equipage of local merchants and minor landowners, and among them the Duke's carriage was not the largest, but it was the most recognisable, because everyone in the county knew the Ashenmere crest, a hawk above a mountain, painted in silver on the door. They did not speak in the carriage. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have spent enough time together to know that not every moment requires filling. Coralie watched the countryside pass through the window, the hedgerows thick with hawthorn blossom, the fields green and wet from recent rain, and she thought about what she was doing and whether she was doing it for the right reasons. She was not doing it for revenge. She had examined this carefully, the way she examined a damaged canvas, looking beneath the surface for what was actually there, and what was actually there was not anger and not vengeance but something simpler. She was going because she refused to let Roderick Swann's version of her be the one that lasted. He had written her story as a tragedy, the woman who loved and lost and faded, and she was going to walk into that chapel and be the version of herself that he had never taken the time to see, which was the version that was always there, which was a woman who could stand in any room and hold her ground. The carriage stopped. Theron stepped out first and turned back and offered his hand again, and Coralie took it and stepped down onto the gravel path that led to the chapel doors, and the doors were open, and the light that fell through them was the pale, honeyed light of late May, and this was where the story had begun, 6 weeks ago in a gallery, and this was where it arrived. They stood in the doorway, long enough for the chapel to notice. It was not a grand entrance. Neither of them had designed it to be. They simply appeared in the frame of the double doors, the way 2 people appear when they arrive at a place together, standing side by side, unhurried, and the light behind them was bright enough that for a moment they were silhouettes, the tall man in crimson and the woman in midnight blue, before their features resolved and the chapel understood what it was looking at. The whispers began in the second row and spread backward like a wave reversing. Coralie Drummond. That's Coralie Drummond. And is that, good Lord, is that the Duke of Ashenmere? The whispers had a quality of disbelief that bordered on theatre, and Coralie felt them land on her skin like something physical, like a change in temperature, and she did not react. Theron guided her to a pew on the left side, near the back, but not in the back, a distinction that mattered because it said they were guests, not intruders, and they had every right to be exactly where they were. He did not touch her elbow or her waist. He walked beside her, and she walked beside him, and they sat down together, and the pew creaked under his weight, and the chapel continued to whisper. At the altar, Roderick had not moved. He was standing in his bottle green coat with the cream rose on his lapel, and his face, which had always been handsome in the way that well-bred dogs are handsome, regular and symmetrical, and communicating nothing in particular, was now communicating a great deal. His grey eyes had gone wide, then narrow, then wide again. His best man, a florid fellow in a brown suit, leaned toward him and said something, and Roderick did not respond. The bride had not yet appeared. The organ continued to play, something by Handel that sounded in the context faintly absurd. Coralie opened the hymnal in the pew rack and found the correct page and held it in her lap. Her hands were steady. The cadmium yellow stain on her left thumb was visible against the white page, and she looked at it and felt a wave of something that was not triumph, but was adjacent to triumph, something quieter, something that had to do with the fact that she was here, in a sapphire gown, with paint on her hands and a duke beside her, and a life that Roderick Swann had not been able to diminish. Theron sat with his usual stillness. He did not look at Roderick. He did not look at the guests who were looking at him. He looked at the altar, and then at the stained glass window above it, which depicted Saint Edmund holding an arrow and a crown, and then at Coralie, and when their eyes met, he raised one eyebrow by approximately 1/4 of an inch, which communicated more than most men managed in a full paragraph. She almost smiled. She held it in the muscles of her face and let it stay there, unreleased, because the ceremony was about to begin, and smiling felt like a concession to the drama of the moment, and she was not interested in drama. She was interested in sitting in a pew in a chapel and watching a man she used to love marry someone else, and feeling nothing that could be used against her. The ceremony was brief. The vicar was a nervous man with a thin voice who rushed through the vows the way a man crosses a frozen lake, quickly and without looking down. The bride, Annabel Hartley Cross, was pretty in the uncomplicated way that wealthy women were often pretty, with fair hair and pink cheeks and a white gown that must have cost more than Coralie earned in a year. She looked happy, genuinely, uncritically happy, and Coralie felt a small, unexpected pang of something that might have been compassion, because Annabel did not know what Roderick was, and by the time she did, the papers would be signed. Roderick's voice when he spoke his vows was steady, but his gaze, twice during the ceremony, slid sideways to the pew where Coralie and Theron sat, and each time it did, his voice lost a fraction of its steadiness, like a violin string going slightly flat. When the vicar pronounced them married, the organ surged into something celebratory, and the guests stood, and Roderick kissed his bride, and Coralie watched the kiss with the professional detachment of a woman assessing a painting, noting the composition, the lighting, the technical execution, and finding it competent but uninspired. The reception was in the garden behind the chapel, where a marquee had been erected, and tables laid with white cloth and silver and spring flowers that had been arranged with the careful abundance of someone who wanted to signal prosperity without appearing to try. Coralie and Theron were seated at a table near the hedge, not at the head table, but not exiled to the back either, a placement that suggested the bride's mother had been uncertain what to do with them and had chosen compromise. Wine was poured. Small sandwiches appeared. The conversation around them was the familiar hum of wedding small talk, compliments about the bride's dress, speculation about the honeymoon, observations about the weather that carried the weight of social obligation, and nothing more. Theron ate a sandwich with the precise efficiency of a man who approached food the way he approached most things, as a task to be completed correctly. Coralie drank her wine and watched the garden and waited for the thing that was going to happen, because she knew it was going to happen, because Roderick had invited her for a reason, and that reason had not yet been served. It came between the first and second courses. Roderick appeared at their table the way a weather system appears, with advance warning in the form of his best man trailing behind him and his mother-in-law watching from across the garden with the fixed smile of a woman who suspects something is about to go wrong. "Coralie?" he said. His voice was warm, practiced, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this greeting the way an actor rehearses an entrance. "I'm so pleased you came, and I see you've brought—" He looked at Theron, and his warm voice cooled by several degrees. "A guest." "Mr. Swann," Coralie said. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you. It's been a wonderful day." He turned to Theron and extended his hand. I don't believe we've met. Roderick Swann. Theron stood. He did not need to stand. He was already seated and could have shaken the man's hand from his chair. But he stood, and the act of standing revealed the full scope of him, the height and the breadth and the quality of still composed authority that came not from his title, but from the simple fact of how he occupied space, and Roderick's extended hand hung in the air for a moment longer than it should have, because the man offering it was suddenly aware that the man he was offering it to was not the kind of man who shook hands on demand. Theron took the hand. The handshake was brief. "Ashenmere," he said. Just the name. No embellishment. Roderick's grey eyes flickered. The name meant something to him, because it meant something to everyone in the county, and the calculation was visible on his face the way a sum is visible on a ledger page, the rapid tallying of what it meant that his former fiancée had arrived at his wedding with the Grand Duke of Ashenmere. "Your Grace," Roderick said, and his voice had changed again, had become the slightly too attentive voice of a man who is aware he has misjudged a situation. "An honour. I had no idea that you and Coralie were—" He let the sentence trail off, inviting them to fill it in, to define their relationship for his records. "Acquainted," Theron said. "Yes, of course, acquainted." Roderick looked at Coralie, and something in his expression shifted, something mean and small that he could not quite keep behind his teeth. "You look well, Coralie, different from when I last saw you." "I was crying when you last saw me," Coralie said, in a voice that was level and dry and carried no more emotional weight than a weather report. "Most people look different when they're not crying." Roderick's face did the thing again, the complicated thing, and Theron watched it with the detached interest of a man observing a specimen. "Well," Roderick said. "Well, I should get back to Annabel. Duties of the groom and all that." He laughed, a short laugh that had no humour in it, and he reached for Coralie's hand, a reflexive gesture, a gesture of possession dressed as courtesy. Theron spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward or make a fist or perform any of the theatrical gestures that men use when they want to be seen protecting someone. He simply said, in a voice that was quiet and clear and utterly without negotiation, "She did not offer her hand, Mr. Swann." Roderick pulled his hand back as if he had touched something hot. He looked at Theron, and what he saw there was something that men like Roderick are not equipped to process, which is authority that does not need to raise its voice because it has never needed to. "Of course," Roderick said. "Of course. My apologies." He retreated. His best man followed. Across the garden, the mother-in-law's fixed smile had become a fixed frown. Coralie looked at Theron, who had not sat down again, who was standing beside the table with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and his hazel eyes watching Roderick's retreating back with a quiet intensity that was not anger, but was not indifference either. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it was true. You hadn't offered your hand." He sat down. He picked up his wine. He drank it. The garden continued around them. The wedding carried on. And between them the silence was no longer the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to speak. It was something else. Something charged and specific and new. A woman in a lavender dress approached the table. Not from the direction Roderick had gone, but from the opposite side of the garden, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had been watching the proceedings with interest and had decided to act on it. "Miss Drummond," the woman said, "I hope you'll forgive the interruption. My name is Mrs. Ellaby. I believe you restored a portrait of my mother-in-law last autumn, the oil painting in the Ellaby Hall in Cheltenham." Coralie blinked. "The Gainsborough study. Yes, the foxing in the lower right corner." "My husband wept," Mrs. Ellaby said. with the matter-of-fact delivery of a woman who had married a man who wept over paintings and had made her peace with it. He said it was the first time he could see her eyes properly in 30 years. I've been wanting to write to you about a second commission. I did not expect to find you here. They spoke for several minutes about the Ellaby collection, about varnish degradation and the particular challenges of Gainsborough's thin glazes, and Theron sat and listened with the expression of a man who was watching something he had predicted come true. When Mrs. Ellaby left, she pressed Coralie's hand warmly and said she would write next week, and she did not look at Roderick's table once. Coralie watched her go. "She knew my work," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not surprise exactly, but was adjacent to surprise. The sound of a woman who had spent 18 months believing she was invisible, discovering in the garden of the man who had told her she was, that she had been seen all along. "Of course she did," Theron said. It was not a compliment. It was a correction. They left before the cake was cut. No one stopped them. The carriage was waiting in the lane, and the matched bays stamped and shifted as they climbed in, and the driver closed the door, and they were enclosed in the dim, leather-scented interior, and the chapel receded behind them as the carriage moved down the hill. Coralie sat with her hands in her lap and watched the countryside pass, and felt the adrenaline draining out of her the way water drains from a held cup, slowly and then all at once. "I need to tell you something," she said. Theron turned from the window. "When he broke our engagement," she said, "he told me that he could not build a future on talent alone. Those were his exact words. He said a man in his position needed more than affection, and I believed him. Not that he was right, but that his assessment of my value was accurate. That I was, in some fundamental sense, not enough." She was not looking at him. She was looking at her hands, at the cadmium yellow stain, and the faint calluses from years of holding brushes and the nails she kept short, because long nails made precise brushwork impossible. "I spent 18 months believing that. Working, yes, building my practice, yes, painting always. But underneath all of it, believing that the man who knew me best had weighed me and found me wanting, and if the man who knew me best believed it, then perhaps it was true." She looked up. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had brought to the gallery on the first day, the quality that saw rather than performed seeing. "It wasn't true," she said. "I know that now. I knew it before today. But today made it physical. I stood in that chapel, and I looked at him, and I felt nothing that belonged to him, nothing he could use. And I need you to know that the reason I feel that way is not the gown, and it is not the carriage, and it is not the fact that you are a duke." "What is it?" he asked. "It's the tea," she said. "It's the Dutch still life book. It's the fact that you noticed the forget-me-not in your grandmother's hand and you cared about it. It's that you carry your own trays and you ask questions about varnish, and you told me I looked ready this morning, not beautiful, not stunning, but ready, which is what I was, which is what I needed to hear." The carriage was quiet, the wheels on the lane, the horses' hooves, the creak of the springs, sounds from a world that was continuing normally while something inside this small moving room was not continuing normally at all. Theron leaned forward. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate care of a man who understands that what he does next will matter for a long time. "Coralie," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without her title, and the sound of it in his voice, in the low, careful register he used when he meant something completely, was something she felt in her chest before her ears finished processing it. "I did not bring you to that wedding to rescue you," he said. "I brought you because I did not want to be in any room where you might be hurt and not be standing next to you. That is not gallantry, it is not obligation, it is the simple, inconvenient truth, and I have been carrying it for approximately 3 weeks, and I am tired of carrying it alone." She looked at him, at his hazel eyes and his careful expression, and the set of his jaw that she recognized now as the architecture of restraint, the effort of a man holding himself still when stillness is no longer what he wants. "You carried your own trays," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "That was when I knew." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, the left one, the one with the cadmium yellow stain, and he held it the way you hold something that is both fragile and permanent, with care but without fear, and she let him. The carriage returned to Hartfield as the sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the tree line, the light going from gold to copper to the deep, saturated amber that painters call the golden hour, because it makes everything look the way you want to remember it. They did not go to the main house. By some unspoken agreement, or perhaps by the simple logic of where they had spent the most time together, they went to the gallery. The portraits watched them from the walls, 14 faces spanning 3 centuries, cleaned and restored and illuminated by the late afternoon light that poured through the east windows at an angle that made the gallery feel like the inside of a lantern. The woman in white held her forget-me-not. The man in the powdered wig maintained his expression of dyspeptic displeasure. The hunting scene glowed green. Coralie stood in the centre of the gallery in her sapphire gown, and she felt the familiar peace of being in a room where she had done good work, surrounded by evidence of that work, and the piece was larger than usual because the man standing beside her was part of it. "I have something to show you," she said. "It's not finished, and it wasn't meant to be seen, but I think you should see it." She went to her satchel, which was still on the marble table where she always left it, and she opened the brass clasp that no longer closed properly, and she took out the small panel, no larger than a folio page, and she held it out. It was his hands, holding a teacup, painted in the warm light of this gallery on an afternoon 6 weeks ago. The right hand curved around the porcelain, the left resting on his knee, and every detail was precise, the blunt tips of his fingers, the faint scar across the left knuckle that she had noticed and he had never mentioned, the way the light caught the fine hairs on the back of his wrist. Theron looked at the painting for a long time. He did not speak. His face did not change exactly, but something behind it did, something structural, something that had been held in place by careful engineering and was now, slowly and deliberately, being allowed to shift. "You painted this from memory," he said. "Yes." "When?" "The night after you brought the first tea, and then every night since, a little more each time." He looked up from the painting and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been learning to read over 6 weeks, the one that was composed of attention and care, and something fiercer beneath both, and he was no longer keeping it behind the architecture of restraint. "Coralie," he said again, and the sound of her name was different this time, not careful but open, and he crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, which was not many steps, but was enough, and he kissed her. It was not tentative, it was not cautious. It was the kiss of a man who had decided, and the decision was not impulsive, but was the product of 6 weeks of watching and listening and carrying his own trays, and sitting in window seats and noticing forget-me-nots, and bringing Dutch still life books, and saying she looked ready instead of beautiful, and all of that was in the kiss, all of it, and Coralie felt it the way you feel a key turning in a lock, the click of something fitting that was always meant to fit. She kissed him back, her paint-stained hand against his crimson lapel, the sapphire silk against the gold buttons, and the gallery around them in its late afternoon light, and the wisteria outside the windows in its full, absurd, extravagant bloom. When they pulled apart, he kept his hand on the side of her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, and he looked at her with eyes that were no longer careful. "I would like to commission another painting," he said. "Of what?" "Of you, in this light, in this room, so that when I am old and this gallery is full of paintings, there will be one that I chose, and it will be the best one. You cannot commission me to paint myself. Then I will sit where you sat and describe you badly, and you will correct me, and between the two of us we will arrive at something true." She laughed, the same sudden laugh from the first tea, and this time she did not cover her mouth, and the sound filled the gallery, and the portraits heard it. 3 centuries of Blackwells looking down at the newest development in their family's history, with the collective painted composure of people who have been watching from walls for a very long time and have learned not to be surprised. 3 months later, at the end of August, when the wisteria had long since finished and the chestnuts along the drive had thickened into their full summer canopies and the gallery was lit by a different kind of light, warmer and steadier, and coming from a sun that had moved south, Coralie sat in the window seat, where Theron used to sit, and watched him carry a tray across the gallery floor. 2 cups, a small pot of tea, a plate of Mrs. Cope's shortbread, because Mrs. Cope had been sending shortbread to Hartfield every week since the wedding, as if the act of lending a sapphire gown had created a debt of butter and sugar that she intended to honour indefinitely. Coralie was wearing a linen dress the colour of raw umber, stained at the cuffs with viridian, and at the hem with something that might have been cadmium yellow or might have been mustard from lunch. Her hair was loose, the red curls escaping whatever pins she had started the morning with, and her satchel was open on the marble table, and her brushes were laid out in the order she had learned from Helena, which was the right order. She was painting, not restoration work. A new commission, her 3rd since the wedding, because the story of the portrait restorer who arrived at her ex-fiancé's wedding beside the Grand Duke of Ashenmere had travelled through the county and then through the neighbouring counties and then through London, and it turned out that women who appreciated a good story also appreciated good painters, and Coralie's calendar was full through Christmas. Theron set the tray on the marble table, careful to avoid her pigments, and he looked at the canvas she was working on, which was a portrait of the mayor's wife, and he tilted his head. "The light on her collar is wrong," he said. "The light on her collar is exactly right. It's too warm." "You are not a painter." "I am a man who has been watching a painter for 4 months. I have opinions." "Your opinions are wrong." He smiled. It was still not a common occurrence, but it was more common than it had been, and each time it happened, it rearranged his face in a way that made the severity look like something that had been covering something else all along, the way soot covers a painting, the way damage covers a forget-me-not. On the marble table, tucked between a jar of turpentine and a bundle of clean cloths, was a small cream envelope. The gold wax seal was cracked. The handwriting inside was ornate. Coralie had kept it, not as a memento and not as a trophy, but as a record, the way a painter keeps a sketch of a composition that did not work, to remember what not to do. She did not look at it. She did not need to. Poole appeared in the doorway with a fresh crate of candles, observed the tray, the shortbread, the 2 of them arguing about light with the easy rhythm of people who have been arguing about light for months, and set the candles down without comment. He straightened one sconce, adjusted another, and left. In the corridor, his footsteps paused for a moment before continuing. It was the kind of pause that a man makes when something has pleased him, a small, private halt in the machinery of the day before the day continues. Outside the gallery windows, a late summer breeze moved through the wisteria vines, which were green now, all leaf and no flower, resting after their extravagance, gathering themselves for next year, when they would bloom again, as they always had, as they always would, whether anyone was watching or not.